Good morning. I'm Lloyd Whitman, Senior Director of the Geotech Center at the Atlantic Council, where we are working to identify and communicate what is required so that emerging technologies can enter use widely across the globe for public benefit, while identifying and mitigating potential geopolitical risks to society. Thank you for joining us today as we release our latest report, Detecting Disruption in Closed Systems, and discuss how data partnerships between commercial and nonprofit organizations can bring benefits to both policymakers and the public. This report is noteworthy for both its content and as a model for cross-sector collaboration around unique data sets. In its content, the report shows how sophisticated data analysis methods can be applied to large commercial data sets to identify even subtle effects of different types of disruptive events and their aftermath, such as extreme weather or public health emergencies, in communities that are relatively isolated in terms of their business ecosystems. These results were revealed through a data sharing framework the Geotech Center created that allows for vetted data analysis to be provided to policymakers, in this case through our partnership with Donna and Bradstreet and a collaboration with the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins. As organizations and societies become increasingly digitized, establishing collaborative networks of private sector companies that are willing to share their data for analysis that benefit the public good is increasingly important. So, without further ado, I will pass the baton to Kiran Jivnani, an Assistant Director here at the Geotech Center and a co-author of the report.
Thank you, Lloyd. Joining me today is Dr. Anthony Sperpignano, Senior Vice President and Chief Data Scientist at Dun & Bradstreet. Anthony, thank you so much for being here. Can you start by telling us a little bit more about your background?
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. This is very exciting on so many levels. I'm the chief data scientist at Dun & Bradstreet, as you said, and what that means is that I work with a team who does innovation. We work on the edge of data science on really difficult problems that are not easily solved with standard machine learning, regression, the kinds of things that are becoming more commonplace these days. So we look at problems like fraud and veracity and identity resolution, and in this case, disruption. All of these problems there's no easy button. So it's very exciting to be able to do that. And then at the same time, I work across the organization to help with our customers when they have big problems like this, or to help with different parts of the world when they're facing challenges.
That sounds great. And I remember when you started working with the Atlantic Council, you said, I really want to work on a meaningful project and I want to work on something that uses, DNB's commercial data corpus. So in what way is this project meaningful? And can you discuss the significance and the importance of the research that we conducted in this report?
So my dissertation advisors would say, let your readers decide if it's meaningful. But the reason why I think it's meaningful is that there are many ways to look at the sort of technical ways that we look at the world, the economy, the behavior of an individual, the behavior of an organization. Things go up, things go down, and we kind of react to them. But the reality of the world that we are all living in now is not only is there disruption, but the disruption itself has become disrupted to the point where we have this, what I call hyper disruption. You don't finish reacting to one thing before the next thing happens. And these things don't happen all at the same time all over the world. They happen sort of asymmetrically. I think of the analogy of people dancing on a dance floor, kind of bumping into each other. So you were dancing just fine until somebody bumped into you, and then you do something unartful, and that causes someone else to have to change what they're doing. That's happening in business ecosystems all over the world right now. And this sort of disrupted behavior is the new normal. There's no new normal that we're going to go back to that's going to be suddenly calm. The system itself has learned in some ways, in good ways. The gig economy is probably stronger now. Businesses are more agile. They have sort of looked into the abyss, and those that have survived have kind of rethought their mission and the way they serve their customers. But at the same time, those who are not necessarily having such altruistic intent, or in some cases, competitors who want to disrupt on purpose. In other cases, things like black swan events that just happen when they happen. All of these things are able to have a much more egregious impact on the ecosystem in the world. So we have to get smarter. The skills that made us successful so far are not going to be enough to make us successful in the future. The reason I think this is meaningful is it provides a new skill. It provides a way of looking at the world, which is not something you can just look up on the internet and say, oh yeah, there's 5 papers that did that thing. We tried pretty hard and we couldn't find anybody doing anything like this. So we think it's very innovative, and we hope it's very meaningful.
So let's get a little bit more into that and really get into the results of the report. Because when you look at the results, you kind of realize that the research team was able to use Dun Bradstreet's commercial data to essentially determine that disruptive events, both either climate related or those that are less easily discoverable, kind of coincided with or closely preceded the perturbations detected by the study method. So what do you think are the implications of such a finding, given the disruptive events that you basically described in the world, particularly for close communities and wall gardens of high importance and security like those in the report?
So let me unpack that backwards. The basis of what we were looking at here was places that are hard to look at. And it doesn't have to be for any particular reason that they're hard to look at. These could be places that just don't have much signal. They don't interact with the world around them very much. It turns out that when you have places like that, people come and go to those places. And while they're coming and going, they're getting their windshields fixed and buying coffee and putting gas in their car and doing commercial things. And so if you pick just the right commercial ecosystem around that place that you can't see, imagine a donut shape. For those that might be math nerds, imagine a hyperbolic donut, because the Earth is a sphere. You get this sort of weird shape that you can flex. You can make it bigger or smaller, depending on how dense or how sparsely populated that area is. And then you get just the right shape to look at, such that when the place you can't see inside the donut is perturbed, the donut is perturbed in a way that is detectable, even if it was already disrupted to begin with. So this sort of irregularity is what emerges here. It's really exciting. The data corpus that we looked at is arguably one of the largest, if not the largest of its type in the world. It is an amazing corpus of data that has all kinds of interactions. So in this particular case, we look for what's called a dyadic relationship, where one party has an interaction with another, buys from, sells to, extends credit, asks about, mentions in social media. Any of those things are dyadic relationships. And if you pick the right ones and you look at the combination of them, any missingness gets washed out, because the data itself is so spread out that as long as you have enough of that data, and we have a lot of data to look at here, you can actually understand when these irregularities emerge. And that's the essence of what this method does. There's a lot of math behind it. How do you pick the shape? How do you tune the shape? How do you make it thick enough, thin enough? Exactly what shape is it? Why isn't it this other shape? How do you know when it moved? What parameters do you look at? There's lots of opportunity to keep nerds really busy here. But the bottom line is that it's detecting change in something that's already changing. And if inside the donut, for some reason, they were to try to change and not project that they were changing, that would become detectable. So it's pretty exciting. It's agnostic, it's commercial, and it's a way of seeing things sort of inside out from the way that the world used to look at them.
So let's build off of that. You've mentioned a few times now this report's really exciting, it's novel, but research should always be able to be built upon. So how do you think that this research should be built upon going forward?
There are so many ways I could take one more step with this research. For simple examples, we didn't look at places where we didn't know what was going on. We actually took cases where we could go back and back test that the thing we detected, that there was a there, that something happened, right? So it'd be very interesting to do a sort of double blind kind of thing where we actually don't know what's going on, and be able to understand something that wasn't known a priori. Another way to do additional research here would be to consider this question of, what if the place you're looking at is trying to look normal when things are not normal? It seems highly supportable in the method and in the math that will be detected. But that's a theory right now. So you have to actually test that. Hard to test. Another thing that we didn't test was all over the world, because we looked at places where we had lots of data, obviously. But it'd be nice to look at places where the sparsity of data is a ubiquitous challenge, and there are plenty of places in the world that look like that. It would also be interesting to look outside of physical space into sort of metaphysical space, like looking at this same concept in a cyber context. We didn't do that yet. And then there's many other things that we could do with the actual statistical methods. We talk about in the paper that the shape that we look at, I called it a hyperbolic donut, but people, mostly so that I can be mocked later. But the idea is that there's this shape that's hard to describe that wraps itself on a spherical Earth. The Earth isn't spherical, and we know that. So there's this distortion that occurs from pole to equator. It would be interesting to see what the elasticity of the method would be if you accounted for that. We decided not to here. We could have, but we decided not to here. Places that are long and thin and oriented north-south tend to have problems with methods like that. Another thing that we knew about and we didn't overly consider is that if the place that you're looking at has more than one nexus, so basically think about like a back door and a front door. Maybe you need to consider the implications of whether you centered yourself on the back door or the front door. And similarly, there are places where there are geographical restrictions where there can't be commercial activity because there's a mountain or a river or a toxic waste dump or something. We artfully avoided those problems in our research for this paper, but one could artfully pay attention to those. So there's plenty of places to go.
Thank you for that explanation. And I think one of the other things that keeps coming up is the data that we used, but I'm not sure the audience really, knows what the Dnb Data Corpus is. So can you describe for them what's included in this data corpus and what kind of data we use specifically in this study?
It's an amazing corpus of data. So this data is collected from all over the world in different languages, different writing systems. It's updated millions of times a day, multiple integrated supply chains. It does not exist in one place anywhere. So it's a highly federated model. Those that are familiar with doing this sort of thing know that there are regulations all over the world. You can't let this data cross the border. This data must stay here. This data can't be over there. We have to comply with all of those regulations, really be hyper compliant with all of those regulations. And at the same time, there's a lot of missingness in the world. So most companies in the world are not public companies, which means they don't have to tell you anything. So trying to keep track of what you don't know and understand what's called the non-response bias or the missingness implications, huge. We have a lot of experience with that, so we can sort of infer what would be there. This isn't just synthetic data. This is very, I'll just call it, there's a lot of experience in how that sort of data gets modeled in a way that can be useful for an exercise like this. And then in addition to those sort of commercial, this is all about businesses, by the way.
Right.
In addition to those commercial aspects of the data, you have the dyadic relationships, buys from, sells to. So we have information on all of those, or many of those types of dyadic relationships. And then we have the implications of mergers and acquisitions and divestitures and startups and all of those things that are happening against the backdrop of the data. So while you're collecting the data is changing. So how frequently do you need to go back and refresh that data to know that the latency is not an aspect of a problem as opposed to a characteristic of the solution? So all of that is part of the Dnb Data Corpus all over the world. If you try to think about it all at once, it's almost impossible to think about. You have to compartmentalize how you see it. The data that we used for this particular exercise was obviously a subset of that. So we focused primarily on the US to get around some of these missingness concerns, and also to kind of stay in our lane that you have to start when you do something like this with the presumption that it might not be possible. And so you can't go in with confirmation bias that this is going to be amazing and we're going to see all of these things. So you leave open the possibility that it won't work. And you start with a research question that's something like, to what extent can we meaningfully observe perturbations in the commercial environment of a place we can't see by looking at the immediately surrounding place that we can see? I think that's very close to the question that we started with. And then you consider that argument. So we curated a set of data that was appropriate to that for a place where we knew that the data was rich accurate, complete, timely, all of those things that you want data to be. We picked the right dyadic relationships so that we would be, so one of the other characteristics of good research is this concept of parsimony. Don't overcomplicate it. So we could have looked at 15 different types of relationships, but then we'd have this sort of multimodal bias to consider. So we kept the numbers small in terms of the number of types of relationships that we looked at. We know math says so, that if we include more data sets, the method will become more discriminating. So we're good to go there. For anybody that's familiar, we use something called Jensen, Shannon, Divergence. It's a series of probability distributions about characteristics of the data. So it's very elegant, and we can throw plenty more data at this and it will do the same thing more precisely.
Thank you so much for explaining that. And yeah, I remember, this report took quite a while with, all of the research questions we considered, the communities we considered, all of the limitations. And yet with all of that time and effort that went into it, I have to ask, did any of the results of the research surprise you in any way?
So one of the things that, yeah, of course, one of the things that surprised me was how, I don't know how else to say this, how well it worked. I kind of expected to get this meh. I think I see a little bit. That's not what happened at all. It was pretty discriminating, which was very nice to see. There were some places where we detected perturbation we weren't looking for, and we thought, oh, it didn't work. The thing broke. And then we went back and found out, no, actually, there were perturbations that nobody knew about that happened during those times. So it was, sort of it giveth and it taketh away. As we were watching this method evolve, it got smarter and it got cleaner. Another surprise, and a very pleasant surprise, was that the three groups that worked on this, Atlantic Council and the folks at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab and Donna Bradstreet, it's kind of like which of these is not like the other. We're all very different. We all come at this from different epistemological frames. We found that common place that we could actually do something like this, that holding environment. That's magic. And that does not always happen. Very often, when you try to do research with groups that are very disparate, there's a lot of attempts to win or people trying to make points from their own unique perspective. That didn't happen here at all. This was a highly collaborative effort. It was delightful.
Yeah, I think the fact that you highlighted that, this really took a lot of collaboration from three organizations that are very different, but we made it work. And I think in a lot of ways it brought out the best of us is a really, really important thing to note. And on that note, I am going to open it up to the rest of the panel and pass it over to Stephanie Wander, the Director of Programs at the Geotech Center. Over to you, Stephanie. And thank you so much, Anthony.
Thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate it. So I'd like to welcome to join us in conversation with Anthony, two additional panelists who were collaborators on this project. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. David Bray and then Natalie Barrett. So David, let me turn to you first, please, to give a brief introduction of yourself and your background.
Sure. Great to be here, Stephanie, with you and Anthony and Kieran and Lloyd, as well as Nat and the entire Johns Hopkins team and DNB team. My role is I'm currently serving as a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. And over the year, I can remember when Anthony and I were first talking, he was talking about his interest with data. And I was recalling how in a past life with what was called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program, we had observed the early indications of SARS when the price of garlic went up tenfold. And that was because garlic's seen as a cure-all in certain parts of the world. And when you see a surge like that, that's an indication that people are looking for a cure. And so the question was, could we extend this? And so it's great to see that after the long journey that we've been on, sure enough, commercial data can tell us what might be happening in other parts of the world.
Natalie, over to you, please. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. So I'm Natalie Barrett. I'm grateful for the opportunity, of course, to work with these fabulous people. I have a background in biomedical and electrical engineering and have the privilege of leading a team of folks at the laboratory that focus on artificial intelligence, big data, and advanced communications. I also have the opportunity to serve on climate. So this opportunity to work on a paper with these folks is really impactful, and we're excited to share the results this afternoon. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Anthony, I'm going to turn to you in just a moment, but first I want to recap a bit for our audience because this is a new kind of report that the Geotech Center has produced. It's a little bit more data-driven, a bit denser than some of our work. So I just want to recap where we are and what the primary scientific goal of this research was. So first off, we endeavored to study the impact of acute disruptions on closed ecosystems, or we've also sometimes referred to them as walled gardens, for which we use military community ecosystems as an example. And when we're talking about these military community ecosystems, what we're talking about is the bases and their surrounding business communities that support them. Using the data provided by Donna and Bradstreet, we attempted to observe perturbations in the patterns of the businesses in the commercial ecosystem surrounding the base. So Anthony, in your view, does this report successfully fulfill the goal of studying the impact of acute disruptions on closed ecosystems?
So definitely, we consider this across all sorts of closed ecosystems. I was just looking at a question in the thread, and I think I answered the wrong person, but you all will figure it out. Someone said, you're speaking in generalities. Yes, we're trying to. There are definitely lots of different types of ecosystems that one can look at here. The characteristics of a closed ecosystem in our regard is they just don't have a commercial signal. It doesn't have to be anything. We looked at military bases in this report. We could have looked at college campuses. We could have looked at crossdocks for large shipping companies. We chose something that was well understood and would hopefully be compelling, but there are many compelling examples. The main characteristic that we need in a closed ecosystem is that the signal, we're not looking at the signal of the thing itself, we're looking at the signal of the area around that thing, and that area around it must be carefully tuned to the right shape and the right degree of sensitivity within the data that you're looking at in order to see anything. If you look too big, you'll pick up all kinds of perturbation, and they might be coming from neighboring ecosystems. We did look at a couple of cases where there were two places like right next to each other. You definitely see that multimodal effect. It's very hard to figure out what you're seeing. So, admittedly, you do need a fairly unique thing to look at here. It has to be closed, it has to be isolated, and it has to have a commercial ecosystem near it. But apart from that, anything that meets those characteristics, and there are thousands of things that look like that, would work.
Terrific. Thank you, Anthony. David, another one of the goals of this report was to determine if commercial data can be used to understand the resiliency of closed ecosystems in the face of disruption. Do you think that this report has improved our understanding of resiliency of chosen ecosystems? And why do you think it's important to be able to evaluate or understand resiliency in such communities?
Sure. So thanks for that question, Stephanie. And maybe to sort of build on both what Anthony said, and there's a question in the chat that was a follow-on from the individual that was asking about generality. They were looking for an example. And so let me sort of say what we're really looking at here, and Anthony alluded to it, is the equivalent of trying to figure out by looking at just the wave motions in a pool, if someone is doing freestyle or the backstroke. And so in this case, we were looking specifically at military bases, and we were seeing if that military base had had an event. It could be a natural weather event or some other perturbation that caused a disruption to the base's activities, but not looking at the base activities itself. In this case, we were looking at the commercial ecosystem around it. Again, the waves in the pool without looking at the swimmer. And so the first step to defining resilience, because resilience is one of those current terms of art that is, you know it when you see it, which is always makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable because it borderlines on jargon. But really what it's saying is, depending on the defined resilient, whether it's coming back to the state that you were before the disruption happened, or coming back stronger after a disruption happened. And then resilience has two different definitions depending on what can mean. The first step in actually being able to tackle the question of resilience means you first have to be able to say, did actually a disruption happen? And so this report adds to that because it can actually show that we can detect disruptions not by looking at the entity itself, and again, example being a military base, but by looking at the commercial activities around it, and that can give us signals. Obviously, as Anthony mentioned, and I'm sure Nat has some thoughts too, extending this research would be to include a double blind test where we actually don't know whether or not the base has experienced this, or whatever ecosystem we're looking at. It could be university settings. It could be other things that are just sort of closed from the world, but there's still an exchange of personnel or something that would be tied to other parts of the world in which you could see those patterns. And I see Anthony is raising a finger, so I'm maybe going to go to him, but I would just say this is the first step to being able to actually define resilience, but there is definitely a longer journey to go. And I'm glad that at least we've been able to at least show that we can detect it, but obviously there's much more to do in terms of quantification and doing other activities. Anthony, over to you.
Yeah, just to add, again, picking up on the question threads. So this is not a method that we found somewhere. This is a novel method. And this method is not intending to be predictive right now. It's a descriptive method. So could you use it to predict, maybe doing something Bayesian, but that's not where we are right now. You need to crawl, walk, run here. And this is really not crawling. This is, trotting pretty fast. The other thing is there are two different types of perturbation, and it's important to make the distinction. We talk about perturbations in time and through time. So something that's in time happened at a specific time. The thing broke, the earthquake happened, the whatever. We know at that time something happened. The other type of perturbation is if you take the dimension of time and compress it and just look through all time, did some kind of disturbance happen? Those are a lot harder to see. These would be things like the impact of organizational change, or what happened as funding was slowly reduced, something like that. The ways that the signals present themselves in the math are much more obvious for perturbations in time than through time. So we looked at those first. But again, more to do, and very exciting and very doable.
Anthony, is there anything else that you'd like to elaborate on in terms of the methodology we've used for this research? I think we've covered it in bits and pieces, but is there anything that you'd either like to make sure we're shedding light on, or put in a larger context?
In the report, it talks about the actual methodological approach for anybody that's interested. How did we draw the shape? Why did we use that method and not other methods? We talk about that a bit. So we didn't just say we did this. We said we considered these three things. Here's why we rejected them, and then we did this. So we tried to be as transparent as we could about why this methodology was selected. The review. Sometimes it's called heuristic evaluation, but sometimes it's not, so I won't call it that. But people looking at this and sort of voting on whether they like the answer or not, and looking across those people for optimism and pessimism, and whether or not they tend to agree dispositively, or if there's some disagreement. There was a fairly sophisticated process that involved all of that. So I think what you would expect in terms of methodological selection was there, in terms of picking a method on purpose and defending why not other methods. In terms of understanding the bias and the results, I think what you would expect is there. And in terms of the empirical rigor, if you did it again, would you get the same answer? That's there. So this is, in those regards, I think it's solid.
Thank you, Anthony. Natalie, I'd love to turn to you now, because JHU played such a significant role in reviewing the methodology of this report. Can you speak a little bit about how the review was conducted and what the results of the review were, and particularly the role that your team played?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. So the lab we were actually able to select our chief scientist of our applied information sciences branch. And what he did, Dr. Savkli, he actually provided an independent assessment of the study's methodology. He took a look at it, and he determined that it was valid. Namely, he was happy with the construction of the graph, with the commercial entities as the nodes. We do a lot of graph analytics looking at entities as nodes, in this case, financial transactions as the edges. And he was happy with the entire process to include the Jensen Shannon divergence method, looking at the variation month to month, which you'll see in the results of the paper. Dr. Savkli also agreed that the graphs are reliable, and they really do highlight the perturbations of changes in the patterns of the financial transactions around these different communities, as Anthony and David are describing. The laboratory also provided some expert interviews to inform the construction of both the well understood and significantly disruptive events at the select base communities. And then we also found folks to provide expert advice regarding the city's centroid of the economic activity. To Anthony's point, it's really important to ensure that you have the right economic activity collected and selected around the bases or whichever community you are targeting with this particular method.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Anthony, I know you've spoken a little bit about this, but could you speak further about what we mean by wall systems and walled gardens when we're talking about this kind of research and this kind of investigation, and particularly how we might be able to expand this and what further sort of insights we might illuminate from this kind of work?
So for a walled garden, just imagine a place that doesn't emit a lot of signal. It's a place that, at least in terms of the type of signal that you're looking at, you can't see it. You know it's there because you can see the spaces around it, but you can't see the thing itself. So that's effectively what we mean in a commercial context. So the reason I keep saying in a commercial context is that we're not looking at signals emissions, we're not looking at digital exhaust, we're not looking at any of the stuff that might come out of that walled garden as it breathes, right? We're not looking at any of that. This is all commercial data that can be observed. In terms of how you could expand this, once you get better at understanding the types of the range and degree of divergence that is expected, what's called the expected variation or the assignable cause variation, then you can start to look at multimodal effects. What happens when two things are being disturbed, or what happens when one thing is disturbing another thing? What happens when one thing disturbs another thing, and that thing, sequential disruption as opposed to parallel disruption. Lots of different ways in which you could use a method like this, but you must start with assignable cause variation, with understanding what you see and what you expect to see and how those differ. And that is the step that is taken in this report. And it's the critical first step in understanding any complex system. Is it stable, and can you describe it? Because if it isn't, then you're going to find anything you want in there. And that's called confirmation bias. And we will not allow that.
David, I'd like to invite you to comment on anything that Anthony said, and in particular, help us understand, what does it mean that the patterns of activity around a community are visible through commercial activity?
Right. So again, it's the idea that you're watching the movements of the water and trying to identify what the swimmer is doing. That's what we're really sort of doing here as a way to explain it. And I think, there aside from the fact that it shows that this method works, and again, it was designed such that we didn't go in with confirmation biases, and huge kudos to the folks at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab to serve as sort of an independent review to make sure that we didn't just lead ourselves on as we were looking at the method, and we did it. I think it also shows the interconnectedness of these closed ecosystems to their commercial activities around that. And even as they attempt to make themselves closed for whatever reason, because maybe they're doing things that they would prefer to keep inside their walls, maybe they're just sort of trying to be isolated, that there is an interconnectedness here. And as we think about, as Nat mentioned, as we think about what's happening with climate change, as we think about what's happening with the world and the increasing questions about either fragility or resilience of supply chains, that what this shows is that even in your effort to be either a walled garden or a closed ecosystem, things like that, you are still connected. Nobody's in a perfect bubble that is completely self-contained and never has to go outside it. And so that, I think, is also an interesting question as we think about taking this to the next level beyond just the fact that this is a powerful data science technique. But as we think about the interconnectedness, what does that mean for both local communities? What does that mean for, we should think about how we strengthen the ties between commercial ecosystems and closed institutions, that they don't operate in a vacuum. And then equally, this gets to the quote that, no person is an island, no man or woman is an island. no nation is either. In some respects. And while that's more on the metaphysical level, as we think about as we go through this, I think we have to recognize that in some respects we are all on this pale blue dot together, and we've got to figure out ways to address these larger issues. Because as this technique shows, if you think you're going to live in a perfect bubble and be self-contained, it's not going to happen.
Maybe I can add something to that beautiful metaphor. Natalie said graph a few times, and I'm sure there's people listening saying, oh, graph, yeah, graph, we do that, we do graph, we got that. Right? This is actually the opposite of using graph to understand these complex multidimensional relationships, because it's just too overwhelming. Millions of edges, and those edges changing at an overwhelming rate. It is computationally overwhelming to try to just look at the graph. If a human being tries to look at it, and you can see in the reports, good luck looking at the graph series that are in the reports. Once you see the answer, go back and try and find it in that graph. You won't find it, because the graphs are isomorphs. They need to be rotated. They need to be stretched. You need to know where to look. There's so many reasons why it is extremely hard to do this in graph. The amount of signal is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it all has value. We're not looking for a needle in a haystack. We're looking for needles and stacks of needles. All of this is valuable if you look at it right.
Thank you, Anthony. That's such a great point. Natalie, I want to turn back to a little bit the role that your team played, because one of the things that you did was help us pick the communities used for this research. Can you help explain why we chose the ecosystems that we did, and also why certain communities were not included in this report? Or I'm sorry, why more communities were not included in this report?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Stephanie. We spent a lot of time debating which communities to consider. We talked about corporations, we talked about universities, and ultimately we landed on a couple of military bases. And the reason for doing that is it's a great starting point. It's sort of somewhat a controlled ecosystem. And we were also looking for examples of places where, as Anthony mentioned earlier, we sort of knew there were disruptions, mainly climate disruptions and other things like that. Particularly base realignments and closures was something else we were curious about. We actually did not pick a base that had a BRAC, but we did find a base unknowing to us initially that was impacted by a COVID shutdown. And so that's really the reason. We started with 5 bases. We actually started from a corpus of about 28 and down selected to those that we really had a robust set of data that would apply to them, and a robust ecosystem around them, so that we would have sufficient data, a sufficient volume of data to do the study.
And diversity.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And diversity. And so some of the locations they were all in the United States. We did initially think about going global. We would like to go global. But, when you look at the bases, they're from Hawaii, they're from the East Coast, the West Coast, the middle of the country. We wanted to include that diversity while also making sure there was sufficient data to really do this assessment.
And that's sort of to help the viewers.
Yeah.
Like the disruptions we're looking for could have been weather related, or could have been like a hurricane. So to put this in perspective, it's the idea that without knowing the disruption that happened to these institutions, and obviously not looking at the weather itself, can you see, and again, I liked what Anthony did with the example of these are needles within needles. The trouble is I'm using the swimming pool example, so that's painful for me. So I'm going to say molecules vibrating. How about that, Anthony? These are molecules within molecules of the pool. These are molecules of water that are vibrating, and we're trying to figure out, looking simply at the waves and how they're moving, did a disruption happen, and was it impactful to the operations of the base? And like you said, one of our pleasant surprises where we thought we found something and something didn't happen, after we actually circled back and talked to them, they said, oh yeah, something did. So that's not a full double-blind test, but that gives you, when people ask, what's the value of this? The value of this is there may be things where disruption has happened and you don't know about it yet, but by simply looking at the commercial data, you may be able to actually find it.
Yeah, serendipity.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, Nancy, please.
I was going to just build on that. David, one of the things that I think was surprising to all of us was that we couldn't always find those disturbances in commercial reporting or in the media, right? And so we really had to go back to those expert sources to validate what their disruptions were. So it's important to understand the value of a commercial data set like done in Bradstreet's.
Oh yeah, and I think that hits on a key point too, is in a world in which we are increasingly getting connected, even those that aren't trying to get connected, we are awash in the immediacy of whatever the news covers. But sometimes that selectivity of what's ever happening may miss the actual things that happen, or it may take 3 years later after the fact or whatever, when people come back and say, oh yes, actually something did happen, even if at the time people weren't aware of it or they said nothing happened. And so the value of this technique as well is both understanding our present and our near past, and going forward, testing both the robustness of this method to other scenarios. And while, yes, folks may look for how do we extrapolate in the future, I celebrate the fact that we can understand the present in ways and how the planet and we're interconnected with it. That is a huge leap forward, especially as we tackle the weighty issue of not just climate change, but future outbreaks, future pandemics, future natural events. Again, I mean, my own experience coming from bioterrorism preparedness, in this case, we had a nation that was, when we detected something that looked odd in the price of garlic spiking, and we had our State Department go and ask them, is anything going on? They twice said over a 5.5 month period, nothing's going on over here. And it wasn't until Vietnam finally invited the folks at the Centers for Disease Control and World Health Organization to play a role. But that was 5.5 months of lost opportunity to try and address the issue. And so one of the things that I find this is interesting is it may serve as a way to remind, again, no nation is an island, no community is an island. If we can come and say we need help or something's happened or we need to address this, that allows us to get closer to the immediacy of whatever disruption's happening, both for the local good and ultimately the global good.
The data doesn't care what you think. And when you find something that you weren't looking for, the data doesn't care. So one of the beautiful things about the serendipity of finding something you weren't looking for is you can't be accused of confirmation bias because you didn't think it in the first place, right? So I think actually when those moments happen, the first reaction is, oh my gosh, the method doesn't work. The thing broke, it's not right. And then you find out, no, it actually did work. It's just that it found something we didn't ask it to go find. That's a beautiful moment if you dig deep enough to really understand what you're seeing. The swimming thing, I know we keep going back to these analogies, but it's helpful. It's not necessarily knowing that swimmer is doing the backstroke. It's knowing that he's doing the backstroke differently, right? So he was doing the backstroke and now he's getting tired, or he was doing the backstroke and his bathing suit fell off. Well, maybe that's not a good analogy, but the idea that something happened that is causing it to be different. And that is where, and we don't know what it is necessarily. We just know that all of a sudden that water got different. Still can't see the swimmer, but the water got different. And that's how
Anthony, and can I prompt you, because I think there's something that can help our audience too, because they're wondering, is everything an edge case? And so you gave a really good example, heartbeats.
Yes.
That in some respects is a perturbation.
Yes.
But is a regular perturbation that you should expect.
Thank you.
And what we're really doing here is detecting that the heartbeat has either gone into tachycardia or has stopped.
Yes.
And so I think that'll help people understand that, no, this is what we showed by looking at enough locations is, and again, we're not at N40 or larger, so it's not a large sample size yet. But with reasonable confidence, you can detect that a perturbation that is irregular from what you should be expecting has occurred.
Yes. So using.
Sorry, go ahead, Anthony, and then
just using David's, just building on that a little bit. Your heartbeat is, you think of it as regular. If you look at an EKG, there's a lot of stuff going on there. Right? Imagine somebody that has AFib or they have some other condition where their heartbeat doesn't look like sort of the average case, right? That would be regularly irregular, right? So you can expect that there's that sort of little hiccup every once in a while, right? That's an irregularity that's expected. What we're looking at here is coalescent behavior that is irregularly irregular. Coalescent and irregularly irregular. That's what a perturbation is. And that very strict definition says, pay attention to this. something happened in the midst of all the other somethings that were happening that's different, differently different. Go look at this. Maybe it's nothing, but it's something you haven't seen before, and it's coalescent to the point that it didn't happen at random.
Anthony, I want to back up a little bit for the audience and just make sure that we're being really explicit with them about the results of this report and what we found. We've spent a lot of time with this, and I want to make sure that we're bringing them along with us. So tell me, and we can turn to each of you, what did you see as the results of this work and the most important, meaningful results of this report?
The biggest one is that you can do it, right? So that an appropriately chosen ecosystem surrounding a walled garden within which you can't see will give you information about perturbation inside that walled garden. We've proven the hypothesis that you can see it. The second big takeaway is that there is at least strong evidence to suggest that anyone in the walled garden that was trying to change your ability to see that would produce perturbation that you would also see. So that's very interesting. So it's called the contrapositive observation, right? They're both there. Very, very interesting, and rarely the case with this kind of thing. And then the third thing is that it's just all commercial data. There's nothing here that you can't go, with the right commercial relationships. That you can't go study. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's open source. You can go click on it and find it on the internet, but it's gettable. And that is pretty exciting, because a lot of times we imagine the existence of data that doesn't exist and then fall in love with what we could learn from it if we had it. Well, we don't have it, but here you do. So the data is there. The data is sufficiently stable and representative. You can see what you thought you could see, and you could see the opposite of what you thought you could see if there's observer effects. Really exciting, really exciting.
Natalie, what was your take on the results of the report?
We were really excited as well that you could actually detect these perturbations given this really high fidelity. And I just want to keep reiterating, right? This is really high fidelity data, commercial transaction data surrounding the facility, that sort of secondary transaction was able to give some information about what was happening or how the base was being impacted, what the resiliency of the base was as well. Being able to see information from, as David said, weather impacts like tornadoes and hurricanes, but also shutdowns, very long shutdowns and very short shutdowns. So it wasn't limited to an amount of time or even a type of impact, which was really exciting to the laboratory.
And to build on what Nat and Anthony were saying, and to make it sort of like take the plane down to almost like getting ready to touch down, examples for folks. Imagine that you have a facility that is, again, a walled garden. It thinks it's operating within itself, but it has a flooding event, and that takes out a significant portion of its operations for a while as it addresses the flooding event. What we're saying is that flooding event, that perturbation is detectable in the commercial activities that are outside of that walled garden. Another example could be there is a short-term shutdown or short-term transition as the commander is changed or something like that. And you would not think that would be reflected in the commercial activities. And what we're saying is there's enough to show that maybe people held off on certain things until the commander showed up or the shutdown ended as a transition. And so at the end of the day, what we're really saying is things that they think they're a walled garden or a closed ecosystem may be more connected in ways that are now with the large corpus of data. And this is only possible for large corpus of data. It's not like you can say, I just need one data set and I'm set. If anything, you would not detect it in a single data set. It is only when you have enough brought together that you begin to see the vibrating molecules that are present. And that's where, again, Dnb's willingness to work with us on this large data set made this possible, and it would not be possible otherwise, because you simply have a large enough corporate data set, both through time and in time, as Anthony likes to say. The other thing that I will say, and I'll let Anthony do a better job, is this shows that swarming effects, that you can detect something odd or different is about how the swarm is responding. And I'll let you, Anthony, because I know you've been referencing swarming and flocking, but it might be good to help people understand both the difference and how this relates to understanding swarming as well.
So there are behaviors of entities that act in groups that approximate things that we see in nature. And two very interesting behaviors are flocking and swarming. So I've learned this, I didn't know this, but the idea of a flock is that it can bifurcate. So it can get bigger and bigger and bigger until a certain point and then split off. And we've all seen this. And a swarm more or less gets bigger and bigger. And I'm sure there's an entomologist out there will tell me that that's not always true, but that the idea is it super aggregation or is it aggregation and bifurcation? And there are algorithms that describe those two types of behavior, flocking and swarming algorithms. And it turns out that if you look at the behavior of entities that are acting in concert with one another, they approximate these behaviors to some regard. And so there's evidence to suggest that looking at a method like this in conjunction with a method like that, you could tell that there was disruption occurring and then understand the downstream reaction to that disruption in a more discriminating way. That's really cool. Really hard, but really cool. We don't really care if it's really hard, so we're going to look at it anyway. That's kind of down the road.
Thanks, Anthony. I want to probe just a little bit more into the remaining implications of the report that we have not yet covered. So Natalie, the increasing digitization of the planet enables subtle tips and cues to be derived from commercial data associated with entities and regions of interest. This is straight out of our report. And one of the things that we highlighted is that those seeking to keep their activities confidential need to be aware of the digital exhaust, not necessarily that even their own walled garden might be producing, but the community around them and the adjacent activities in the broader ecosystem. So what do you think closed ecosystems should be doing about this, and recognizing that now some of their things may be trackable that they may not have realized were?
That's a great question. I think in general, I think it's an opportunity to really grab some additional data sets and start to understand beyond Donna and Bradstreet's data set, what are the other data sets that should also be aggregated to get a better understanding of the resiliency of a community itself, right? So it might be a base, but it might also be a particular district, it might be a particular community. And to understand, look back through the data, see a disruption, monitor a couple of them that you find are impactful to your community, and better understand what that looks like in the data so that you have sort of a baseline or a reference. I wouldn't say a baseline, but a reference to go back to start to understand what's possible with this data set. As leaders, it's our job to really ensure the success and the resiliency of our communities. And as David mentioned, our communities are becoming more and more interconnected. And so I'm hopeful that in the future, there will be an opportunity to encourage a number of organizations to share that corpus of data. I'm not sure exactly how, but hopefully in some sort of web-enabled platform where companies can be protected of their IP, but for the good of others, we can share this data and really get to understanding some of these secondary and tertiary effects that can tell us about our communities. David.
Oh, sorry. Well, and Nat, to build on what you're saying, I'm really excited, and this is something that on the early days with the Geotech Center about hardly almost a year and a half ago or 2 years now, the idea that we can do an immune system for the planet. I mean, with COVID, we lost time in responding, and that impacted lives, and impacted communities, and impacted businesses, and impacted governments. And what this shows is maybe we don't have to wait until official channels say something's going on over here, you need to respond to it. That if we buy into the fact that increasing digitization of supply chains, increasing connectivity of the planet, increasing awareness of what's happening both from space, but also on the ground and things like that, that we can have early warning, not just for future outbreaks, but again, if there's a climate change, I mean, we know there's some that say within the next 50 to 60 years, more than 25% of the planet will at some point in time be a displaced person. And that could be because of a short-term flooding event or something more climate related. And displaced people will need social services, they'll need assistance and things like that. But if we wait until maybe official channels say, we've got a problem with food over here or a problem with water over here or with climate change and they need assistance, that might be too late to be pre-positioned. But if we're listening and watching for those signs that a disruption or perturbation is happening, we could pre-position support for those displaced people. We could be a way of trying to help them get ahead of this. And so I look at it as this is the idea that we have shown that even things that try to be closed can trigger a smoke detector. In this case, the data methods that Anthony has done. And if we can have enough smoke detectors around the planet, maybe we can actually both save lives, save families, save communities, save commerce by being sort of as close to the disruption as happening as opposed to waiting for official channels to acknowledge something's going on over here.
David, let me ask a quick follow-up to that. So given that, what's your guidance for policymakers and civil leaders here about this new and increased access to data? And what do you think are the steps needed to better leverage data, better recognize that, you know, we're able to understand the impacts of human activities and nature's disruptions? And so like, what's the pathway to these smoke detectors in your mind?
Right. Well, so recognizing policymakers come in all different types and kinds. I would say what this shows is, regardless of whether you're open or closed, you're probably going to reveal information. And so with that being said, the way forward is not to try and double down on camouflage or anything like that. You have to figure out new methods. But, you know, short version, and this is a gross oversimplification, you can run, but you can't hide. I'm not sure that's exactly what we want to be as a takeaway here, but you have to figure out new ways of moving forward in terms of if even in your efforts to be closed, you will give information, then you have to figure out ways whether it's about making supply chains more resilient. I'm actually here halfway around the world right now having conversations with some companies about your supply chain actually is a valuable source of data for you and for the planet. And actually, if you understand the perturbations happening in your supply chain, one, that gives you competitive intelligence, but you could also make that data available for the local communities as well. And you could actually say, it looks like based on what's happening here, there may be a food shortage event or a famine event happening in this local area. That's massive goodwill for you as a company. And I think it also points to that in this era of digitization, more things from space, et cetera, we traditionally have looked to governments to talk to each other. And what I'm saying here is that policymakers may need to turn to companies because they may have even more valuable insights than what governments do in their own means. And I see Anthony's nodding because that's exactly why I reached out to him was, I think companies may better understand what's happening with climate change, what's happening with outbreaks, which was just happening with natural events, than what governments do. And so the question is, who at the World Health Organization, who at the Centers for Disease Control, who for thinking about how climate change is impacting climate, who is talking to the companies so they can begin to better understand this?
Before I let Anthony build on that, I want to just make sure we pick up on something and don't skip over it, which is, you know, Anthony, someone in the audience, some leader somewhere is sitting in their chair going, I can camouflage these perturbations. We'll figure out a way to, you know, address any challenges or data leakage. So can you explain to us why, first off, how someone might try to camouflage those perturbations and then how they might be detected? So why is it not really feasible to simply hide or mask the behavior in some way?
There used to be, I don't know if it's still there in the Midwest, a facility called Subtropolis. It was built inside of a salt mine, and it was rentable space that you could use for like storing things. You could have, in theory, like dry cleaners and stuff operating down there for the people that go down there. I don't know, it's probably a Starbucks, you know, things like that. Imagine that you did build an entire commercial ecosystem, in that case, underneath a pre-existing commercial ecosystem, so that you effectively have two coincident ecosystems, physically coincident, except for the z-axis, right? Maybe in a situation like that, it would be hard to discriminate because you wouldn't know it was there, and there would be a pre-existing signal from a pre-existing ecosystem literally on top of the one that you, but now you have to tunnel under a city and build an ecosystem. You know, there have been efforts to do things like that around the world, and that, yeah, sure, you could do that. we don't usually do things like that. And, they tend to get found out and then become very salacious and everybody's paying attention. So it becomes the opposite of what you want. That's not realistic. You could do all of your business in crypto. You could do all of your business in, invisible transactions. But unless the people live there and you make them like live their lives there and have their children there and like never leave, they're going to buy coffee and get their windshield fixed and order pizza and do stuff that human beings do. So I don't know how you don't do that. There's, David and Natalie are talking about all these wonderful world impacting types of frames. There's a commercial frame here too. If we think about fraud and what's happening with supply chain resiliency and the gig economy and ESG and all of these things are not completely understood. And in cases like fraud, when you observe them, they change because the bad guys change when they think they're being watched. So you can't model it because you model how they're no longer behaving. So, all of these things that have observer effects in them, all of these things that are themselves nascent and changing are extremely hard, if not impossible to understand. This gives us a new way of knowing, a new way of understanding in the concept of whatever the gig economy is doing. I don't necessarily understand it, but I know it changed. Well, that's interesting and that's helpful. And it's finding that change amidst change that has been really confounding to mankind. Einstein is quoted as saying that problems should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. This one's pretty complicated, no matter how simple you make it. But the conclusions are just compelling beyond belief. And I hope, this inspires somebody, that this talk inspires somebody to go take this and do something more with it. Make us look, naive, like build on this. That's the whole point of doing something like this.
And Anthony, if I could build on what you were saying, I mean, you talked about the self-contained tunnel city and everything like that, and it would really have to be completely self-contained to include the family members of the people working there. I mean, one of the things that I did in a past life about 20 years ago is, if there was a VIP event, we would have teams of, certain teams go for a 3 or 4 days event before the VIP event, and we would plug into school absenteeism. Because if there's a sudden jump in school absenteeism, there might be something making people sick. Another thing we did was 911 calls. Another thing we did was over-the-counter drug sales. And sure enough, at one VIP event, there was a spike in gastrointestinal over-the-counter drug sales. Turned out it was nothing bioterrorism related at all, but it turned to be that what people ate at that sporting event caused them to rush out and get GI medication. But really what you're saying is it would have to truly be, I mean, because we have family members and they will be signals even if we're trying not to send a signal ourselves.
Yeah, and even though this is not about people, we're making it sound like it is, right? But those are metaphors, right? You're talking about what's called, what doesn't matter what they're called. When you look at drug sales, or you look at all those things you just said, that just suddenly left my mind. Garlic in your previous example, which I think is just brilliant. You have to be looking at the right thing, and that thing has to change. This is connecting everything to everything in every way that everything connects to anything, and then looking at how those connections change. People can't do that. It's too hard. We can't even imagine that. It's too hard. And that's what a method like this does for you.
I'd like to turn back to Natalie for a second. And Natalie, first off, feel free to comment on anything you've heard thus far. But I'm also curious if you can give us a 50,000-foot view on what a report like this means to helping us better understand our planet, to the way that we can use this to maybe assess or forewarn food crises or climate instability, or where you sort of see commercial data sets providing indicators and warnings that are in a non-secure, like not arguably security space, but sort of in this bigger human impact, global, sustainability perspective.
Yeah, I think fundamentally the opportunity space here, as David was alluding to earlier, the ability to pull in these different types of secondary data sets that aren't directly correlated to what the question you're asking, but provide sort of indications and warnings about what's going on. is really powerful. And so you talk about food crisis. I think someone already mentioned supply chain. If you understand the local supply chain, maybe for a farmer who's unable to get access to seeds or access to water, right? And how that impacts the ability to produce a crop, and then how that there impacts the ability to have resources in the community to purchase things that would normally be purchased, right? It really is all interconnected. And so the more that we are willing to build relationships between corporations and governments and laboratories to really share this data, these large data sets that are interconnected, the better we'll able to inform resilience, not just for a community, but globally, to David's point.
Now, let me just turn back to you for one more question. And David, I would love for you to comment on this as well. So the report recommends that high security organizations perform an extended analysis or possibly even red team the worst case scenarios in terms of surveillance, threat exposure, or just even, assessing disruption. So what are the benefits of this analysis? What should it look like? And how does the data from this report show that this is an important thing to do?
Yeah, so Stephanie, I think it's important when you think about the resiliency of our communities, the ability to understand sort of worst cases that have happened in the past, things that we know were catastrophic. So, I'm here in Maryland, and we've had a number of 100-year floods in Ellicott City. I think 2 and 5 years, right? And so that's a great opportunity as an example to go back and look at the data, to look at this method, to see how that impacted that particular area. And the reason it's important is that it might provide future tips and cues that an emergency is happening, so that people know immediately before something's reported that there's an issue. It also potentially provides understanding about how to better insulate or improve an organization to be more resilient. Maybe there is an adjustment in how companies or facilities are in place in a particular region, like in Ellicott City.
And to build on what Nat shared, I think it would be the idea that whether you call it security, safety, stability through obscurity is probably a quaint idea that will not succeed. You cannot rely on obscurity, given again the digitization of the planet and the increasing amount of data that's out there. To go one step further and to build on what both Anthony and Nat has been saying, there is an interconnectedness even in cases of closed organizations or walled gardens. And that interconnectedness is important given the disruptions that are already happening and the disruptions that we think are highly likely in the future. I think of islands in the South Pacific, where we know there's going to be increasing waters as climate change plays itself out. There'll be splashover events. Those splashover events may make the water not drinkable, both for those that are living on a closed ecosystem or walled garden, but the local community as well. And so if you are attempting to be a walled garden in an area that may be a little bit more fragile or non-resilient to these changes, ignore the health of the surrounding community and companies around you at your own peril. We have to think about being more broad, that essentially no organization is an island. We are all connected and you need to reach out to them.
Absolutely. Anthony, this analysis was made possible due to the commercial data sets provided by DnB, which, as we've discussed, is a really unique and exciting opportunity. Should other private sector companies with large commercial or even other kinds of data be engaging in such a project? And how can we build out a framework to make this possible?
Yes.
Only if you can clone Anthony, though, right? He is kind of
right, for sure.
Well, that was what was hidden in the, yeah, but be careful what you set out to do, because you may have to do it, right? So I think that, there's no easy button. You can't just push the machine learning button. You can't just push the magic AI button that everybody thinks we have in our back pocket. You can't just hire 4 people who, appear to have credentials and say, let us know when you're done. This requires a bunch of people who are multidisciplinary, who are willing to engage in peer review, challenge each other's thinking, question the veracity of the data, question the latency of the data, question the applicability of the corpus of data to the question, refine the question. This is not something that starts with why don't we just, and then fill in the blank. There's no easy button here right now. Maybe someday there will be, but they haven't invented that yet. So yeah, companies that have data that is particularly dyadic, so involving one party doing business with another party, if they understand that data well enough and the ecosystem that it represents, if they can speak to what's missing in it, what bias is in it, if they can go into it without a preconceived notion of what they might learn, then they could learn some amazing things. And I can imagine corpora of data like that that are non-commercial. Medical comes to mind immediately. Agricultural comes to mind immediately. Transportation comes to mind immediately. There could be some incredible observations. It kills me that we have rush hour, for example, right? But all of the solutions to solve rush hour that start with why don't we just don't work so well. They usually produce something more stupid, right? It's possible that we could understand that, especially in the context of having recently turned off all the airplanes and all the cars for a while, right? There's enough data out there that we might be able to learn something amazing that has nothing to do with what we studied here. But you got to be very disciplined about it. There's empirical rigor here is key. You really can't fake your way through this.
All right, I'm going to open up the next two questions to anyone that would like to answer, or if everyone would like to weigh in, please do. What do you all see as the most important takeaway from this report and why? So David, let me turn to you first.
So I think, again, we've highlighted that it's possible. I think that's what the real value of this is. We did do some rigor in terms of making sure it wasn't just a one-off. Already, as mentioned, there was the example where we thought we had a misfire because it looked like we were detecting something, and it turned out actually, sure enough, something did happen, and that our data did not know that initially. And so that's valuable. I think it's a proof point. Obviously, Anthony and Nat have shared some ways of extending it. I think the other takeaway, though, is I would love, and one of the things in terms of extensions, I would love to then, in addition to doing a double-blind test, circle back to the communities in which this data is about them and figure out, as you detect these perturbations, what do they then take away from it? That it's not just nice to know that you're seeing it, but what do they then find in the data as obviously participants in it as a walled garden? How does it change what they're doing both inside themselves, but also with their nearby community environment? Because I think, again, part of the reason why I think Nat and I were excited about this is we know climate change is happening. We know it's continuing to play itself out. And we need to think about a world in which we can try to mitigate the harm, both to people, communities, animals, plants around the world, and also in some respects begin to think about what does resilience look like. And I know you asked early on, Stephanie, what does this mean for resilience? This shows that at least that you can detect perturbations. And then the next question is, can we get to a future where using this method and using additional study, can we quantify what resilience really looks like?
Nat, most important takeaway for you.
So I was going to build on that because I think one of the most important pieces here is we went back and looked at data that had been captured in the past, and something that it apparently looks in the data like a lot of what we found was coincident with something that happened. And I would love to look at the ability to determine if you could detect something in these commercial data sets real time as something is happening. And potentially to understand the delay. What was really interesting to me was simply that the media reporting was so disconnected with what was actually happening in these data sets that were much more accurate because of the volume, the variety, and the veracity of the data sets. And the ability to really figure out how to connect data sets, disparate types of data sets together, the power of that, you don't see that very often. I think this is one of the first examples where looking at commercial data has implications on things that we wouldn't expect. And so I hope that this really pushes us further to start combining different types of data sets to better understand how this data can help us understand what is happening with our communities and how we can protect them into the future.
Amazing, Nat. Thank you. Anthony, what is your most important takeaway from this report and why?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is you can't just throw data at the problem. I said before that the data doesn't care what you think. It doesn't care when you learn something. If you don't like what you learned, it just keeps talking, right? So this is not a data problem. Yes, of course, you need data. You always need the highest quality data you can get. The data is always imperfect. The data is always incomplete. The data is always more and less than you think it is at any given time. The key thing here is asking the right questions and challenging what you think you're learning until you know what it really means. Of course, you need a lot of data. Of course, you need a lot of math. There's even calculus here. Sorry, but it doesn't matter. What really matters, what really matters is that you take the time to ask the questions. What would have to be true for this to be true? What can't be true unless this is true? Those kinds of questions, as painful as it is, if you don't ask those questions, it doesn't matter how much data you have. Nobody cares. You've got to be able to make sense out of it. And that sense making still comes from human beings asking tough questions.
All right, guys, final lightning round here. So what advice do you have for anyone undertaking this kind of work?
You want to go first, Anthony?
I always have three, you know that. Real quick, be humble. Find other really smart people and work with them. You can't do this by yourself. So I feel blessed that I found some really smart people to work with on this. And the second thing is be open to learning. You may not discover what you intended to discover, but you might discover something even better if you pay attention. And the third thing is just take one step. Don't be overwhelmed by how big it is. Take one step and then look at where you are and take another step and you'll get someplace interesting.
To amplify, I mean, Anthony definitely hit all the bases with that answer, so it's hard to improve. So I will actually call on something that Anthony brought to this process that I thought really gave it rigor, which was the idea that at each step in the process, it was open to say, for this to be true, what are we basing it on? And for it to not be true, what would we have to know? And it was almost like a rigorous approach that would ensure that we didn't let confirmation bias bring us along. And in a world in which we increasingly are discovering that humans' ability to make sense of the interconnectedness of the world is limited. I mean, we're in a world that is fundamentally different than how evolution and natural selection pressured our brains. I mean, we are meant to remember about 80 faces at most, maybe 90, and now we're in a world of 8 billion, going on 8 billion. And so that interconnectedness is challenged. And so I appreciated the rigor that you brought to this, Anthony, and want to thank you for that. And then similarly, I appreciate that Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab was able to provide sort of an independent review to make sure that as we went on this journey, we weren't convincing ourselves that we were heading to water, but in fact we had found water.
I would say an equally rigorous review, and we really appreciate that. So Nat, I want to give you the last word before we turn to audience Q&A and a final round of questions, which I'll turn back to Kieran Givnani to lead. But Nat, what's your advice for anyone wanting to undertake this kind of work?
I applaud really anyone willing to take the risk and go into this, study the resiliency of their particular community. It's challenging to admit that we have disruptions, that things happen, but it's really important to illuminate them, to take the time to understand them, and to recognize that disruptions will come and go just as climate and other events in the world, right? We've had so many challenges with health and we had COVID and monkeypox, and right. So we're constantly being hit with disruptions that are either within our organizations or around our organizations. And so, I encourage anyone who's considering, should I look at this? Yeah, just take a look. Take a disruption that you're aware of that's impacted your community and try to figure it out. It's just one step at a time. As Anthony said, be humble, but you will learn something, and you'll learn something that will really impact your organization and improve the future resiliency of your community.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And thank you all to my panelists for this incredible discussion. It was thoroughly enjoyable and really rich. Let me turn now back to Kieran for to go through our Q&A. Thanks so much, Kieran.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we've had quite a few questions from the audience, and our panel has been very diligent in answering them, but I do want to go through some of the ones that have already been either closed or answered. So one is from Tommaso. He says, thank you for a fascinating report. Is your method new? And is it predictive or descriptive? With the right data, could this method be used to predict supply chain disruption? So a lot of questions, but Anthony, I see you smiling, so I'm going to start with you.
I'm smiling because I answered him in writing, but I answered it in the wrong thread, so he probably didn't see the answer. And I tried to say it during the talk. So right now, this is a descriptive method, not a predictive method. So could it be predictive? It could be Bayesian. You know, describe a little bit, move a little, describe a little bit more, something like that. But it's primarily a descriptive method. Is it new? Absolutely. We tried really hard to find out if there were other researchers who had tried to do something like this in this way. It's always hard to prove that there isn't, but we failed to prove that there is. So we did a pretty extensive search for that. And then the last question was applicability to supply chain. Oh, for sure. You have to be careful that this is a geocentric approach. So, you can't do the global supply chain. You could do something like this for the global supply chain, but this is particularly based on the premise that the immediately adjacent ecosystem will be perturbed. So if you tried to do it for, North America, that's too big an ecosystem, and you're gonna detect, I don't know what you're gonna detect, nothing useful. So it's got to be sufficiently discriminated to be effective. But when there's a ship stuck in the middle of the Suez Canal, or when there's a shortage of rare commodity that's only produced in one place, or when there are sanctions that involve a particular port or something like that, yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. David, I also see you nodding. Do you want to follow up in any way?
Well, I mean, I think Anthony covered it quite well, that this could be applied to supply chains that are surrounding a very specific surface area, that we're not talking about the global supply chains. I think it could also be expanded to thinking about just sort of, it could even, maybe it's not supply chains, it's just economic price indicators around a neighboring area as well. And again, I gave the garlic example as that's an indication if people are looking for a cure because there's some unknown atypical febrile illness, that is an indication of itself. What it also gets to, though, is that patterns of life, be that patterns of human life or animal life or even plant life. If you have enough data on that around whatever you're actually studying, those patterns of life are still connected to the walled garden or the closed ecosystem in ways that will be indicative if you're looking at it with a large enough corpus of data. And as Anthony said, while you can never definitively say somewhere in some basement someone figured this out and they never told us, we did a very rigorous search. And I would also submit that rare would be enough data of this veracity, this variety, that you would be able to do this method, because it's not just enough to have the method. You really actually have to have the data through time, across places, and across multiple types of data to be able to do this as well.
Thank you, David. Natalie, before we jump to the next question, do you have anything to add?
I would just foot stomp what David said about having the right volume, the veracity of the data. And I'm curious, I would love to look into, if we started knitting this data set with a few other data sets, if we might actually improve the findings, right? Might we improve the amplitude or detecting more things that we weren't looking for?
Great, thank you, Natalie. Let's jump to the open question. So we have a question from Ellie Creasy. I thought an interesting aspect of the time series and resilience is that one can look at the data from a recovery standpoint. How do the data relationships recover over time and to a new or different state?
So we actually looked at that. So I talked about perturbation in time and through time. One of the ways of looking at perturbation through time, which is where recovery comes into place, is when the Jensen Shannon divergence dissipates back to its prior unperturbed state. That doesn't mean you reached the same new normal. It means you reached a new stasis. You reached a new normal, if you will, which may or may not be like the old normal. There's a song in there somewhere. I think that the method would be very effective in assessing claims that things are back under control. But, you know, we need to test a lot more. We've only done this a few times. We've turned the crank a few times here. So we have to be very careful not to get too far out over our skis. But the research that we've done so far suggests that that is absolutely within the pole of what we're doing here.
Awesome. David, anything to add?
Oh, I think Anthony hit the nail on the head. It's not saying they're back to the way things were. It's just that they're back to some sort of steady state. And you use the word things are back under control as shorthand for that steady state. That steady state may be a different state than what was before the disruption happened, but that it's now back to some regularity. And I think that is a significant contribution to the field because resilience remains one of those squishy terms at the moment. Some people, it means you're back to the way things were. Other cases, you're back stronger. And in quantifying it, I mean, I know people talk about resilience index, but I'm like, that makes me a little uncomfortable because it sounds a lot like jargon. And Nat's smiling because we both come from a world in which there's this thing called the Hallmark questions, which question number one is using absolutely no jargon. What are you trying to do? And so I celebrate the concept of resilience. I think it needs to be tackled. I really like that the person asking the question used the word recovery because I think that's a little bit more definitive. As we go into a world in which we know as a result of climate change, there will be also future outbreaks. I mean, anyone who thinks that we're through the gauntlet, no, I mean, you know, again, I celebrate the fact that we're at an unprecedented number of people on the planet than ever before. That also just means as we get more and more connected, there will be more outbreaks, there will be climate related events, there'll be other natural events too. And so I am particularly interested as to, as this goes forward from a recovery standpoint, can we de-jargonize and actually give some stronger, more rigorous definition to when we say something is resilient? And then can we get more strong? And that would obviously require further study on how would you demonstrate it and prove it.
Thank you so much, David. And those were all of our audience questions. Again, you answered most of them while we were going through the discussion. But Natalie, you did say something interesting in your previous answer. You said that, you know, you would be curious to see if we could combine data sets from different companies or different organizations. So with that, I'm going to ask you a completely separate question, and that is, can you make the case for why other private sector companies should join you? And, you know, what kind of data would you like to see more available if it's possible?
It's a great question. I think one of the data sets that we'd love to see are the network or computer network transaction data. You know, Anthony mentioned he has a particular data set. I think adding in there some of the Bitcoin transactions sort of to back that data set up and to understand how that matches. He also mentioned the transportation data, which I love transportation data because it has geolocation data in it. So you know where the transactions are occurring, which is really important for the methodology that's been developed here, really focus on a particular region. Anytime that we can add multiple data sets from what I've seen, we're increasing the volume, we're increasing the diversity, right? And so based on, you know, the 5 V's of good data, it's really important and encouraging that if we can pull more data sets together, we'll have a better understanding of our current state and the resilience in the future.
Can I just build on that a little bit?
Of course.
Natalie and David will have heard me say this probably 100 times, but it bears saying right now. There's a reason why when we go to court, we swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, because those are 3 different things. And so another way that it might be interesting to consider this method is to see when untruths are entering into the data, because that would cause a type of perturbation that we don't expect. I have not thought that thought yet, but something Natalie just said made me think it. So that would be another direction to consider here. As others bring their data, the likelihood that they would all be sort of lying in the same direction is unlikely.
Is unlikely, yes. And actually, Anthony, you hit the nail on the head, is that I mean, again, folks can find the immune system for the planet idea that's been pitched by the Atlantic Council. It really is the idea that you can bring people together with different data sets to get earlier in the warning of future outbreaks and possible pandemics. However, as Anthony noted, and building on what Nat said, we know there have been cases where entities have withheld that a outbreak is happening, and that's, they have various reasons, and it's not to say find fault with that. It's just they have had, and so there may also be a skewing of data because nobody wants to say things are going really badly here.
So that would
But
be an
as Anthony
example
said,
of not telling the truth or not telling the whole truth, right?
yeah, being non-random in the selection of data provided. How about that? Is that a bias? And so I raise that because the more I would love to start seeing a United Nations activity or something at the global level that is trying to pull this together, because it could serve as, again, the collection of smoke detectors for the planet and serve as early warnings as we go into a world in which our fates are tied together on this pale blue dot we call home.
Thank you so much, David. And I think that's an excellent note to close our discussion on. So thank you all for being our featured panelists today. Thank you all for being co-authors on the report. And for those of you in the audience that have not gotten a chance to read the report yet, it will be linked in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining today's event.